The first story comes from a man who used to walk home from late shifts every November. One foggy night he noticed something odd. His footsteps weren't echoing alone. Another set, lighter and quicker, followed just behind him. No matter how slow he walked, the steps adjusted. He turned several times but saw nothing except a thick wall of fog. When he finally reached his house, the steps stopped. But before he could go inside, a soft whisper brushed against his ear, calling his name in a voice he swears belonged to his mother, who had passed away 3 years earlier. He locked himself inside, but that night his bedroom door slowly creaked open. A silhouette stood at the end of the bed, small, familiar, and softly crying. When he reached to turn on the lamp, the figure vanished, leaving the sound of footsteps running down the hallway. For weeks afterward, he heard those footsteps outside at exactly the same hour, as if whatever had followed him home on that November night never actually left. Another story comes from a college student who rented a room near campus. Every November, the house made strange sounds, knocking, scratching, low humming, but she assumed it was the heating pipes. One evening, she woke up from a nightmare and noticed something wet dripping on her forehead. She turned on her phone flashlight and froze. Long, dark streaks of water were dripping from the ceiling. The strange part was that the water wasn't clear, it was tinted red. Terrified, she called her landlord, who insisted there were no pipes above her room. She pressed her hand against the wet ceiling, and it felt warm like skin. Before she could react, a deep thumping started above her. Something alive, was crawling inside the ceiling. The landlord claimed she was imagining things, but the next morning she found claw-like scratches on the ceiling surface, as if something inside had tried to break through during the night. A third story comes from a woman who experienced an encounter in the woods behind her house. She always loved taking nighttime walks in November because the cold air felt refreshing. But one evening she noticed a tall figure standing between the trees. It had no distinct features except unusually long arms. Thinking it was a tree, she kept walking, but after a few seconds she heard leaves crunching behind her. She turned and saw the same shadowy figure, closer this time. She ran, but the forest echoed with rapid dragging sounds, as if the thing was gliding after her rather than running. She reached her porch and slammed the door. When she looked through the window, the figure was standing at the edge of the forest, staring at her. It didn't move. The next morning, she found enormous footprints leading up to her porch, each one too large to belong to any human. The fourth story involves two brothers who stayed at their grandparents' old farmhouse every November break. One night, they heard tapping at their bedroom window. Thinking it was a branch hitting the glass, they ignored it. But the tapping changed into a slow scratching, then into a series of knocks, almost rhythmic. When the older brother approached the window, the tapping instantly stopped. He lifted the curtain slightly and saw a pale hand pressed against the glass from the outside, with long fingers that didn't look human. He screamed, waking his brother, and when they both looked again, the hand was gone. The next morning, they discovered long drag marks across the dirt outside the house, circling the entire building. Their grandfather simply said, "It always comes back in November," and refused to explain any further. Another terrifying event took place on a lonely highway. A man was driving home late at night in early November when he saw a woman on the side of the road in a long white dress. He slowed down, thinking she needed help, but as he got closer, he saw that she was floating inches above the ground. Her head slowly tilted up, revealing a hollow space where her eyes should be. Panicking, he hit the gas and sped off, but his radio began playing a soft lullaby even though it had been switched off. The woman's reflection appeared in his rear view mirror, sitting in the back seat with her hollow face inches from his. When he finally reached a gas station, she vanished, leaving the back seat ice cold. For the next month, the same lullaby played randomly in his car whenever he drove alone at night. The sixth story centers around an elderly woman who lived alone. Every November, she felt someone watching her through the windows. She dismissed it as anxiety until one night she woke to the sound of someone whispering inside her room. She turned on the light and saw nothing, but when she checked her voicemail the next morning, there was a recording of her sleeping, soft breathing, turning, shifting. Something had been inside her home while she slept. close enough to record her. Police found no signs of forced entry, but every night she heard slow footsteps moving around her house. In early December, the sound stopped completely, but on the final night of November, she heard a whisper behind her say, "See you next year." Another November horror came from a group of friends camping in the mountains. They sat around a fire when they heard faint singing coming from the woods. A woman's voice, soothing but wrong, as if multiple voices were layered together. They tried to ignore it, but the singing grew louder. When they shined their flashlight toward the trees, they caught a glimpse of a very tall woman with long black hair, standing unnaturally still. Her mouth was wide open, and the singing was coming from inside her, even though her body wasn't moving. They ran to their car and drove off, but the singing continued outside the windows until they reached the main road. The next morning, they returned for their gear and found their campsite torn apart. Scratched into the dirt were 3 words, "Come back tonight." Another chilling story comes from a delivery driver working late November nights. One night, he delivered a package to a remote cabin. The customer wasn't answering the door, so he left the package and turned to leave. But the cabin door slowly opened behind him. A woman peeked her head out and whispered, "He's inside. You shouldn't have come here." Before he could react, she slammed the door. As he hurried back to his truck, he saw a tall, shadowy figure standing in the window, staring at him with glowing red eyes. He sped away and reported the incident, but the company later told him the cabin had been abandoned for years and no one was supposed to be living there. The 9th story happened to a man who worked night security at an old museum. In November, the building always felt colder than usual. One night, he heard footsteps echoing in the main hall. He checked the cameras and saw a child wearing old-fashioned clothing walking slowly across the marble floor. But when he went to check the hall himself, it was empty. When he reviewed the footage again, the child was now standing directly in front of the camera, staring into it with dark, sunken eyes. The final story involves a family who moved into a new home last November. Every night at exactly 3 a.m., the youngest daughter woke up and pointed at the corner of her room, whispering, "He's back." Her parents thought it was just imagination until they heard knocking on the wall behind her bed. One night they placed a camera in her room. The footage showed her sleeping peacefully, then suddenly sitting up and staring into the dark corner. A tall shadow slowly formed on the wall, stretching upward like a figure rising from the floor. The shadow leaned toward her bed, and the temperature in the room dropped so drastically that the camera lens frosted over. When they watched the footage the next morning, they moved out the same day, convinced that whatever had visited their daughter was not human. November nights still haunt them because the daughter sometimes wakes up even now and whispers, "He's still watching." November hides things most of us prefer not to acknowledge: the cold, the darkness, the quiet. All of it creates the perfect atmosphere for the unseen to move freely. These 10 true disturbing November night stories remind us that some shadows don't disappear with the sunrise, and some whispers stay with us long after the month has passed. If you're watching this at night, remember to check your windows, lock your doors, and never ignore footsteps that don't match your own. Some November visitors never really leave.